I'll start with the share screen. I'll start with an advert. Just after I received the email this morning from Tim, giving the Zoom link, I had an email from one of my colleagues in the library saying, oh, you mustn't miss the film on film 4 at 9 o'clock tonight, something called American Animals. And it's all about a rare book heist in an American library. And I'm sure it'll be far more entertaining than the talk I'm about to give you now. Fortunately, we've got no rare copies of Audubon or anything in the university library, so we've got no, I hope we've got no risk of any rare book heists taking place in the Aberystwyth University Library. What I'm going to try and do this evening is to share some of our lesser known benefactors with you. And what I'll start by doing is talking about some of the people I'm not going to be talking about this evening. So we have well-known benefactors who you probably will have heard of before now. George Powell from Nantios, who really was the prime benefactor of the library in the 1870s. He originally intended to give his books to the county council, but they dithered so much over the organisation of where they were going to store it and whether they were going to accept the collection. In the end, he gave it to the university instead. And as a result, we're very grateful. And his book collection has been the subject of earlier studies. Harry Heuser recently from the art department and others have written about that. There's still treasures to be found there, and it's something I'm working on in the background, but it's not the subject of this evening's talk. Any more than John Rees, who was the first professor of Welsh and Celtic Studies at Oxford University, a Ponterwydd lad who never forgot his roots and gave his wonderful collection of material on philology, Celtic studies to the university when he died in 1916. I'm told that a lady from New Zealand is about to start a PhD on the library, his library collection, with Robin Chapman in the Welsh department. But of course, things have been rather delayed by the pandemic. But that's something I'm hoping we're going to hear more about for the future. We have this very striking bookplate for materials from John Rees, which is devised by the university. I've still been finding books in the store which came from him, which haven't been noted in any catalogue or listing, but that's a subject again for the future. Obviously, a number of academics over the years have given significant donations to the university. Again, I'm not going to be talking about former principals. Thomas Charles Edwards gave a large number of theological volumes to the university. Some came to us not directly, but via his time from Bala Theological College, as in this example on the left-hand side of the screen here, which has the Bala stamp at the bottom. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a bookplate for Thomas Francis Roberts, the second principal. And his collections are rather more prosaic, I'd have to say, things he had as a student and gathered over the years, a fairly random collection of material. Books from his collection have still been coming to light, and a couple of boxes in the Tower store in Old College were only dug out a couple of years ago. And they got the dust and cobwebs of a century, and they were sitting in my room in the library for a long time. No great rare treasures, I'm afraid, but nonetheless still nice to find these things turning up a century later. And then one of the noted early benefactors, and in a sense we don't talk about so much these days, is Evan Pentland Jones, the first registrar and librarian of the university, registrar from 1872 to 92 and librarian from 1872 to 1902. He left 1,650 theological volumes to the university library. I spent a happy afternoon in the early days of the first lockdown back last May, searching out his tomb in Aberystwyth Cemetery, the sort of thing you can do in social distancing. We can visit the dead still, so I spent some time looking for his tomb and got a shot of that here. And then more mainline academics, people like Frederick Rudler, one of the first professors of science in the university, professor of geology. He left Aber fairly shortly and went off to London to a museum down there. He did found the Aberystwyth Museum in the university, something of significance. He gave us a large collection of pamphlets. On the right-hand side here, we've got um, a pamphlet from Professor Owen about the Crystal Palace and the geography and inhabitants of the ancient world. There's a collection of several thousand pamphlets which aren't fully catalogued, which includes some rarities and something which needs some more work on in the future. And lots of interesting material there, but again, he's not somebody I'm going to talk about in detail this evening. And then there are characters you'll know from the past, Hermann Ette, who had a splendid academic career, specialising in Persian Arabic literature, unfortunately hounded out of Aberystwyth at the start of the First World War, rather disgracefully. He left books on Persian and Arabic studies to the university. I doubt that they've ever been looked at since he left, but he was a genuine Aberystwyth scholar and a great character in his own right. And then more recent academics who you probably may have known in your younger days, some of you. E.G. Bowen, a real Aberystwyth character in geography for many years. When I was first here as a student, even in the 1970s, he was still driving an aged Mini around, and I remember walking up the Bearth, that very steep hill up the Bearth, and walking as quickly as he was driving his Mini along with sort of, he drove around about 5 or 10 miles an hour, a sort of a quaint character, but a very good scholar. And then John Challoner, who left a wonderful, superb collection of geological materials to the university shortly before his death in the 1990s. Great treasures there. That's something we could exploit more in the future if we still had an active geology department. And then many of you will remember Richard Brinkley from the library, a real Aberystwyth character. When he died in 2000, Jonathan Davis and I went and cleared his flat next to the ambulance station on the Llanbadarn Road. And the flat was a small 2-bedroom flat he shared with his mother. She died very shortly afterwards. But there was something like 150 meters of books in that small flat. The floors were actually groaning under the weight of these books. Came to the university, and we spent some time since then sorting the collections. There is a Brinkley collection there. It's a pretty eclectic collection, as you might expect. Lots of religious material, but lots of oddities. Walter Scott and some of his strange enthusiasms, but a noted scholar, and lots of stuff which we're glad to have received. Anyway, these are not people I'm going to talk about this evening. They're perhaps worthy of talks in their own right. But what I want to talk about are some of the people you may not have known from the past, going back to the earlier days of the university. Perhaps giving collections directly to the university, or collections which have come to us via their descendants. So, and this is very, very much an alphabet soup from A to Z of the donors, and it's not arranged in any structured fashion. So starting with Thomas Colby, who was a former director of the Ordnance Survey back in the 1820s and 1830s. He was responsible for a lot of the initial mapping of the Great Britain, particularly Ireland, Scotland, the Celtic areas. He was brought up in Pembrokeshire by aunts, and hence his connection with West Wales. And his son, William Colby, was a governor of the university at the beginning of the 20th century, sold land on the Bearth, which went to form the basis of the site for the chemical laboratories on the Bearth Road, and also the adjacent area. But he also gave books which had come to him from Colby, from Thomas Colby. And so we got 150 books from Thomas Colby's time with the Ordnance Survey, including some very interesting materials. I wrote an article about this in Sheetline, the journal produced for the Ordnance Survey enthusiasts back in 2016. And just to highlight a couple of things from that collection, an account of the Bell Rock Lighthouse, which we received, which Colby received from Robert Stevenson, with a very long letter to Colby, who was obviously a friend of his, describing his work with the French lighting engineer Fresnel visiting Calais and Paris to look at the work which Fresnel had been doing on lights, and linking the two mapping exercises in France and Britain at the time. So that was actually quite an interesting find. Another well-known person who Colby was in communication with was Edwin Chadwick of sanitary fame, who was responsible for the report on the Sanitary Commission of the Labouring Poor in the 1840s, and a great social reformer. And he actually wrote to Colby suggesting that he might join in his work. I think that actually came a little bit too late in Colby's career. He was retired from the Ordnance Survey at that time, so he never took it up, but he was well regarded by the leading figures. And then the Colby collection as such includes books on surveying, as you might expect, a lot of mathematical volumes, which I won't show for you this evening. Some explorations, as in this voyage of discovery, the Northwest Pacific, from Captain George Vancouver in the 1790s. Vancouver was a strong character who got into a lot of trouble for having flogged the nephew of William Pitt. Caused a great upset. But the volumes are actually very valuable. A complete set with the maps and charts would fetch a good 5-figure sum. Unfortunately, when the donation came to the university, it didn't include the volume of charts, which rather reduces its significance, but nonetheless, it's still a nice thing to have. So the Colby collection is significant. And then somebody I'm sure you won't have heard of is Dr. Robert Humphrey Cook, who was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons and was a general practitioner in Stoke Newington. And you may wonder why on earth somebody like that would give a collection to Aberystwyth University Library. And I must admit, I'm still puzzling slightly over this. This was in the 1890s. I spent some time pursuing this, wrote to the Royal College of Surgeons and got his photograph from their collections. We have a lot of books with the R.H. Cook book plate. This is a copy of Cicero, the school book, which he had from his time at Charterhouse. But there's no immediate explanation as to why he gave the books to the university. I suspect that he had some connection with Hugh Owen through the church, but that is not certain and needs a bit more work. But I do know from some research over the last few years that there are connections with the borders, which again may help to explain why these books came to Aberystwyth. And there's a lot of hidden family history which I managed to dig out. The Cook family actually originated in Wem, Shropshire, just outside Shrewsbury. And we have a family Bible going back to the 1780s, which records the births of R.H. Cook's parents, so his father, William Cook, who was born in 1785. The third entry on the left-hand side here, and then the various other children of the Cook family. Sorry. And then on the right-hand side, we have a description of Abney Park, where a lot of the family are buried in London, the cemetery in London, East London, which have some of the Cook family tombs. But Dr. William Cook, the father, was a surgeon in plaster in London. And so we've got a number of interesting and expensive books which he collected over the years, including this copy of Albinus from the 1740s, Tables of Skeletons and Muscles of the Body. Lavishly illustrated, as you can see, and with some annotations made by Dr. William Cook. Copies of this generally fetch £3,000 or £4,000, so it's a nice thing to have. Sadly, of course, we've got no medical teaching in the university, but it's a rarity. But William Cook Senior became secretary of the Hunterian Society, which has just celebrated its bicentenary, and he acted as secretary for the first 15 or so years of the society's existence. And we have a number of donations to him from people who were speaking at Hunterian Society meetings, including this one from Edward Stanley, FRS, Ontarian Oration to William Cook with the respectful regards of the of the author. And then a really big name giving a book to Dr. Cook was David Livingstone from his missionary travels in South Africa. And this is a book given by David Livingstone to William Cook in 1857, a first edition. And this is tucked away in the strong room and long been recognised as a nice thing to have. And then R.H. Cook's wife, Charlotte Cook, also, she post-deceased R.H. Cook, but she left Matilda to the university as well. She was a typical Victorian lady, I suppose, filling her time by collecting clippings and maps from newspapers and magazines of the period. She followed Dr. Livingstone's travels from magazines, pasting them onto cloth and picking up maps of the earlier London railways, which are quite fascinating. Lots of interesting bits and pieces there. And so there were several thousand books from the Cook collection. The Ontarian Society had a bicentenary celebration a couple of years back, and I spent an afternoon in Wem searching out the church, the Congregational Church with the family had links. Hazlitt had Wem connections, and it's quite possible that the Cook family knew Hazlitt. Going on to another early benefactor who's been documented by somebody else, Reverend John Davis Glandura, an independent minister. And he again left a large number of theological volumes to the university. He was briefly researched by Alan R. Davis back in the 1970s. And he said that John Davis Glandura, also known as Sean Lethe, Sean Cummo, and the books from his collection were donated to the library by his grandson David Jones of Llanarth. John Davis of Cardiganshire born and educated at New Earth Lewid and Newtown Academies before accepting the pastorate of the independent chapels of Glandura and Morar in Pembrokeshire. Famous first and foremost as a Bible scholar, and it comes as no surprise to find that theology predominated in his library. And then we have a number of books from the 16th and 17th centuries from his collections. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any photographs of John Davis. Given that he died in 1884, there may well be some around, but there's nothing on the internet at all. Somebody who was rather better known, but again, rather difficult to find pictures of, was a chap called Charles Francis Egerton Allen, who was actually a lawyer, barrister, practiced in India and then back in Britain, was briefly MP in Pembrokeshire in the 1890s, and then Pembrokeshire dignitary, Justice of the Peace in Tenby, landowner, gave a large collection of law books to the university. Rather surprising, I couldn't actually find a photograph of him as such, only a newspaper caricature shown on the left-hand side here. He gave a large collection of nominate law reports to the university and other working editions of law texts from the time. Some of these have been disposed of since then, but again, quite a valuable collection from the period. Richard Ellis is a name that some of you may well know as a librarian, both in Aberystwyth and in Oxford. He did a lot of work on Llwyd, researching his life, although he never actually published on that. But he was a book collector in his own right and collected a number of important 17th century texts, including this Abridgment of Christian Divinity, 1656, shown here from Relabius. And we have these distinctive signatures in them. He wasn't very happy in Aberystwyth. He worked with Ballinger, but didn't really get on very well with him, and went back to Oxford, where his first love lay, I suppose, in a sense, and able to carry on his research work there. But a number of his books came to the university, including this. And then something which I was very pleased to find was this stray copy of Cicero with a signature for John Aubrey, the 17th century antiquarian, John Aubrey, RSS. I was quite doubtful of the provenance, but I did check with the Bodleian, and they were quite happy with the signature. Aubrey was always very proud of his membership of the Royal Society and insisted on sticking RSS after his signature. And then we just got a little Don Richard Ellis underneath, which has been written at a later stage. But the book in itself is of no great value, but the Aubrey connection makes it significant. And clearly he had a good collector's eye going around the bookshops of Oxford. Basil Jones, another worthy who some of you may have heard of, Bishop of St David's in the later part of the 19th century. He's responsible for the consecration of Holy Trinity Church, which I attend, and his portrait sort of hangs in one of the transepts of the church. We don't have his theological books. I suspect some of those may be in the library at St David's if we ever get down to have a look at that. But certainly a lot of his classics volumes came to the University Library. And they have this distinctive book plate shown here. And then we can follow his school career. Here's a prize volume of Herodotus he received from Shrewsbury School in 1830s, given to him by Benjamin Kennedy, who was headmaster of Shrewsbury at the time, 1840. And of course, Kennedy is well known as being the author of Kennedy's Latin Primer, which went through many editions. So there's a link with another noted figure. And then going on from his Shrewsbury days to his Oxford days, he went to Trinity College, Oxford, and we have a copy of Aristophanes from that time, 1710. This has a signature for W. Howley. I did wonder if this might be William Howley, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the period, but having talked to Lambeth Palace, they said no, that wasn't his signature. But I do wonder whether it might be the signature of William Howley's son, who was another William Howley, who was a New College, Oxford student who died fairly young. And given that Basil Jones and Howley were both active in architectural societies in Oxford in the 1840s, Howley, Bishop Howley as patron and Basil Jones as a keen undergraduate and fellow at that time looking at church architecture. I think there may be a family connection there. And then moving away from the Anglican Church to the Calvinistic Methodists, I suppose a stronger feature of Wales, Richard Jones of Werne, a noted early Calvinistic Methodist. And we have an interesting collection of books which came from his collection via his son Griffith Jones, who was a farmer and a chapel deacon in Towyn. Richard Jones has a portrait in the National Library, which I lifted for the talk here. And I spent a happy afternoon with Richard Arnold and Helen Palmer searching Llanfwrthyn churchyard for Richard Jones's tomb, which is in the foreground on the slide there. Llanfwrthyn Church is notable as the site of Lloyd George's first significant case where he came to fame, the burial case where the then vicar was refusing Methodists and dissenters burial in the churchyard, and Lloyd George won the case and came to prominence. It's actually slightly ironic because this was obviously rather later in the 19th century, but when Richard Jones died back in the 1830s, there was no problem in him being buried then in the churchyard of Llanfwrthyn. And so we have the burial slabs, Richard Jones, and his work in the Calvinistic Methodist connection, learned divine, blah, blah. Llanfwrthyn Church is well worth a visit if you've got the opportunity. It's now redundant church in the care of the Friends of Frienders Churches, but has some interesting architectural features, and also, as I said, this historical association with Lloyd George. So we have a collection which I pieced together from these books which were given by Griffith Jones, most of them from the collection of Robert Jones. This one actually has a book label for Griffith Jones, but in many of them you can actually find Robert Jones's own signature. So this is a sermons from Robert Boyle's lecture, from Richard Bentley, noted classical scholar, and it's 1735. But then we've got books, as on the right-hand side of this slide here, with Richard Jones's own signature. This is Synodicum Gallia, about Reformed churches in France. The structure of the Reformed Church was obviously of interest to the Calvinistic Methodists. They were looking at their structures in the early 19th century, and this has Jones's own collection. I did an article which was supposed to be coming out in the Calvinistic Methodist Historical Review, Welsh language review. It hasn't appeared as yet, but I have actually got the blog up on David's blog pages of the Society if you want to have a glance at that. We can trace his book purchasing around the towns in Wales and the borders. Interestingly, he collected copies of William Perkins, a good early Calvinist figure from Cunliffe back in the 1790s. So we have book purchase dates and times, books from Shrewsbury, books from Liverpool, Mithun and places. So you can follow him around. And he seems to have travelled quite extensively for a lad who came up from very basic roots and obviously was very learned in his field. And then there was a memoir of Richard Jones, which was produced just after his death in 1833 and 1834, which again we have a copy of in the library. So an interesting figure. Then moving more towards the current day, somebody who gave books directly to the university is William Peyton Kerr, Professor of Poetry at Oxford in the 1920s, and also formerly Professor of Literature at Cardiff University in the early days. And he gave several hundred books from the Early English Text Society, which are in our working collection on the top floor of the Hugh Owen Library, in fact. Some have an even more interesting pedigree because they came to occur from the library of George MacDonald, the Scottish folk story writer. And MacDonald has a very striking book plate, as you can see here on the right-hand side. So an example of a book from the Kerr collection. This is an edition of Piers Plowman, Langland, with the MacDonald book plate, and also a hidden book plate which I've not yet identified, Manu 40, on the right-hand side there. And going back to Welsh dissenters again, Thomas Llewellyn, a figure who I guess not that many of you will know of, was a Baptist in the late 18th century, mid to late 18th century. He was from humble background in South Wales, Hengoed, trained as a tailor, but clearly had academic potential, went and got a degree in Aberdeen University, got an LLD eventually. His book plate on the left-hand side here, the Library of Thomas Llewellyn LLD, and it has an armorial as well, so clearly had some pretensions to pedigree. We have a number of books from his library, not obviously given by him, since he died before the end of the 18th century, which came to the library from the library of the Baptist College at Bristol. And they must have been having a clear out of classical volumes, since the books that came to us were theology from Thomas Llewellyn, but his classics books. And so we have quite a number of those, some of them with this Baptist College stamp. Thomas Llewellyn is noteworthy for producing a large edition of the Welsh Bible in 1769. So on the right-hand side here, we have a Welsh language Bible, and 20,000 copies of these were distributed, helped to ensure the survival of the Welsh language at that time. This copy came to us from a farmer in Bow Street. But Llewellyn wrote on the history of the Bible. So this volume on the left-hand side here, Tracts Historical and Critical, includes the history of the Welsh Bible. This copy came to us from the library of a chap called Breeze, who was one of the solicitors in the Portsmouth practice where Lloyd George started off. So that again is an interesting historical link. And then not all the books which came to us from Thomas Llewellyn were classics. There were a number of other Welsh language items, including this pamphlet on arithmetic from the 1760s, 1768, which I believe is the first Welsh book on arithmetic, Welsh language book on arithmetic, so that's a curiosity. And this is a bundled volume of sort of 10 or 15 pamphlets, all sorts of diverse subjects which are hidden in our book collections there. And then going from humble roots to the nobility and faded members of the gentry, we have a number of gentry benefactors. Sir Martin Lloyd of Bronwith. Bronwith is now one of the sadly decayed houses of South Wales, as you can see here. And the Lloyd family effectively died out after the First War. Martin Lloyd's son fought and died in the First World War as an officer. And Martin Lloyd gave a full set of the Valpy Delphin Classics to the university. So there's 143 volumes, which are sadly mouldering away in Glenavon store at the present time. But they deserve better fate than that. But it's not just gentry who've given books to the university. Large landowners who came to wealth through business also gave us books. J.B. Willens was on the Court of Governors in the last century, early in the last century, and he gave a large collection from his uncle, Francis Nicholson, who was a fellow of the Zoological Society. So not directly to us, but indirectly via Willens, we've got a very interesting collection on bird books and botany books from the library of Francis Nicholson. So here we see Francis Nicholson's bookplate and an illustration of some very pretty looking clematis. And a bird I managed to behead in making a scan, but naturalist Canada with a hybrid bird of some sort, and an illustrated dictionary of gardening. So there's an interesting range of material from Nicholson. I need to do more work on that collection. Somebody who I have spent a bit of time trying to research is Miss Helen Owen of Weston-super-Mare. When I was doing an initial trawl through the university collections, I came across her name on a number of occasions and see that she's also been an interesting benefactor to the National Library over the years. A lot of material went to the National Library in the first couple of decades of the 20th century and to the university in our collections. And one of the books which first came to my attention was this first edition of Gulliver's Travels, Miss Helen Owen Weston-super-Mare. At Gwyn, when he was librarian, did some research collating the Gulliver here, and found that it was actually a first edition, first date copy of Gulliver. So that is indeed a rarity and certainly worth a 5-figure sum. And I was rather intrigued as to why this lady, Helen Owen from Weston-super-Mare, should have given us books. There was very little about her. But doing a bit of digging, I come to some conclusions that she actually was a frustrated member of the gentry who didn't quite manage to achieve what she wanted in life. She was an unrecognised member of the Owen family from Orielton in Pembrokeshire. And if we go back 2 generations before her, her grandfather, Sir Arthur Owen, described as being baronet, never actually inherited the baronetcy because he was cut off by his father because he'd entered into an illicit union with a Miss Frances Agers of Bempton, who he didn't actually marry. And as a result, their offspring were illegitimate and not recognised by the father. He didn't inherit the baronetcy when his father died. It went to a collateral branch of the family. Clearly, I've read reports suggesting that Helen Owen was shunned by polite society for her curious roots. When the inheritor of the baronetcy died in the 1862 or 61, 62, I think it was, Helen Owen spent a lot of time and money in trying to establish that her grandfather had married Frances Agers and that her father, John Owen, was legitimate, and that so therefore she had a claim on the Orielton baronetcy, but or at least on the estates. But sadly, the attempt to advertise in the Pembrokeshire Herald and other papers at the time came to nothing. So she was frustrated, never moved into RA Elton, and as a result, perhaps beneficially to us and to the National Library, the collections came to us after her death. And then somebody who perhaps wasn't quite the figure he claimed to be, John Alison Picton MP. He was again an independent preacher, a congregational preacher, and an MP. He claimed to be a friend of Gladstone, but having plodded through 16 volumes of Gladstone's diaries, I find only one reference to Alison Picton, and I think they were probably more acquaintances than friends. But nonetheless, he has Welsh connections, and he did give us some 50 books, some of them quite valuable, as a bequest. He had a connection with Gladstone, I think, through the fact that they both had holiday accommodation in Penmaenmawr. So Alison Picton had this house on the left-hand side here, Caerllion Hall, which is now bed and breakfast in Penmaenmawr. And of course, Gladstone spent many holidays there as well. But then, looking at the books which actually came to us from Alison Picton, I found a strange connection with the Supreme Court of the Holy Roman Empire, shown on the right here, from Wetzel in Germany. And then we have this volume of Vacta Glossarium Germanicum from the early 18th century, which has a bookplate at the middle of the slide on the right-hand side from Johannes ab Ulmenstein, who turns out to be one of the assessors of the Supreme Court of the Holy Roman Empire. So a very curious item to have found its way to Aberystwyth University in later years. After Ulmenstein died, the book went to a professor of philology at Dresden University, I think it was Putnam, and then to a professor of theology there, and then to Picton, and so to Aberystwyth. So you can actually trace books through their quite lengthy histories on occasions. Roberts has stronger Welsh roots, may well be known to you as an educationalist. He was a Calvinistic Methodist, suitably severe-looking chap from the beginning of the 20th century. Had an interest in geology and the sciences, but he made his name really as an educationalist with the University of London, based in Kensington, as you see from his card here, Bedford Gardens, Kensington. So has roots in Welsh education. His collection came to us, or his geological book came to us through Mrs. King Roberts, and another formidable figure, Mary King. She was from Brighton originally, but ended up in Ponterwood of all places. And you see references to her in the Cambrian News occasionally, opening fates in Aberystwyth and the like. Probably a very formidable character. Sadly, I didn't manage to find any photograph of her at all, but a noted Welshman who gave material to the university. And one of the examples here is this copy of Woodward's Essay Towards Natural History of the Earth from 1702, quite valuable in itself. And it has a fascinating pedigree because it came to Roberts from the library of the Grace the Duke of Buckingham, Stowe House. And of course, the Duke of Buckingham was a famous case of a duke going bankrupt in the mid-19th century, very profligate, wasted all his money on the gaming tables in South France, etc. Ended up living in the Great Western Hotel in Paddington. When he died, the house having been sold up 10 years before that. And this was one of the lots from that sale. You can still go around Stowe House today. It's now a public school, but the grounds are maintained by the National Trust, and some fascinating gardens there, which are well worth a view for those who are interested in political gardening. And then somebody I want to come on to, in fact, I was just about to go on to this last year when the pandemic started, but rather been caught up since then, John Venn. And this is one of the rather stranger bequests to Aberystwyth University, which I've not yet quite worked out. He gave some 50 books to the Aberystwyth University in the 1890s, I presume as a result of the appeal for the library collections. He gave very large collections to Cambridge University Library. There's a printed volume in our store of books he gave to Cambridge University Library. Perhaps these were duplicates, perhaps these were, I I don't know what the reason was for him giving the material to us, but there is some interesting material there. And so we've got John Venn's rather spidery hand to the right hand side of the slide here. The book by Augustus de Morgan, another link which I could develop for the future. John Venn, famous through posterity for the Venn diagram, which are memorialised in the chapel in Keys College. And then we have books which have other links going back to the early part of the 19th century. John Venn here with a link to Masquerier, who was a painter in Brighton, and a copy of Elements of Intellectual Philosophy from Robert Eden Scott, who was a professor of philosophy at Aberdeen University. But that volume contains a lengthy letter from Sir Richard Phillips, who may be known to some of you as the noted publisher, Leicester publisher, who made large sums from books on travel and some radical publishing. He was actually imprisoned briefly for selling Tom Paine's Rights of Man in the 1790s, but made quite a fortune. So I think there's probably a little article to be written there, but something I need to come back to. And then going back to wealth properly or improperly obtained, let's talk about Robert Ward from Narberth in Ireland. Late Robert Ward of Narberth, 1905, a collection which came to the university. He was Pembrokeshire landowner, JP. I think he died in slightly mysterious circumstances, but he was an elderly chap, and I think he just went out walking one day and never came back. They found his body some while later. No inheritance, no successors, and so the books came to the university. But the interest here is not so much his direct bequest, but the family history. And so we go back to previous generations and their link with Ireland. Bernard John Ward was a vicar in Bangor. And 19th century, we have a copy of Virgil from 1800 there with the distinctive Ward bookplate, armorials, which Bernard Ward, when he was at Oxford in the 1820s, spent a lot of money getting it bound by Charles Lewis in Duke Street, who was one of the leading binders of the period, and also in getting extra illustrations in the copy. So he makes a note here, so saying extra illustrations, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, the slide is rather faint. I can't read the exact detail here, but anyway, this is one of the extra illustrations for that volume. But the real interest in the Ward family is the source of their wealth. And Castle Ward is one of the noted National Trust properties in Northern Ireland, a rather bizarre 18th century mix of classical and Gothic. Evidently, the first Viscount Ward wanted one type of architecture, his wife wanted the other, and so they compromised by having a house built in two halves, as it were, front and back. But the first Viscount Ward was active until the later 18th century. His direct successor was a Nicholas Ward, born in 1750. And when Bernard Ward died in 1781, Nicholas Ward should have inherited, but he was clearly a lunatic, and so was unable to take proper ownership of the property. I think all was well for a while, because the second son, Edward Ward, ensured that everything was kept, and the first son, Nicholas Ward, was fairly properly looked after and the like. But when he died, Edward Ward, in 1812, his son wasn't really of an age to take ownership of the property or to take responsibility for the property. And so the care of Nicholas Ward, the lunatic, passed to the youngest son, who was obviously a black sheep. There was a chap called Robert Ward, born in 1754, Captain Robert Ward, who proceeded to strip Castle Ward of all its belongings and realises the proceeds. And I suspect this accounts for some of the wealth of this minor branch of the Ward family. In due course, Edward Southwell Ward, the son of Edward Ward, became the third Viscount Bangor when the lunatic died in 1827. And so he was able to take over Castle Ward and restore the property, although not with the contents. But I say Robert Ward and his family had inherited the contents and were able to take advantage. And these included expensive book collections. So an example I've got here is Pine Horace from 1733, 1737, which is one of the prime examples of 18th century book production. John Pine was a famous London engraver of the period, and the whole volume, text and illustrations, is engraved by Pine. So it's a very expensive book to engrave and to produce. And the subscription pages at the start have all the crown heads of Europe subscribing to it. And then, of course, the Ward family were taking a copy. We have a copy now in the university, which is worth several £1,000s. Ward family, generous donations to the library. They also acquired wealth from other sources. So Robert Ward, Bernard Ward died fairly young, and Robert Ward came into the family inheritance, as it were. He was at Winchester. He was a Wikimist in the 1840s. And as we have here a copy of a book presented to him by his uncle Robert Biddle Phillips, on a visit to Longworth, 1843, and testimony of his approval of the manner in which he distinguished himself at Winchester, 1842. I don't know how he did distinguish himself, whether on the sporting field or presumably by passing through examination or whatever. But Robert Biddle Phillips is, again, a wealthy character from Herefordshire. He was a High Sheriff of Herefordshire, a barrister, a place called Longworth, just outside Hereford. He was a convert to Catholicism and founded a Catholic community there. There's also a Catholic chapel just outside Longworth, which is now in the care of the Historic Chapels Trust, and where I'm hoping to get to post-pandemic to have a look at, see where the Phillips wealth went. But we have several books from the Phillips family which came to the library through Robert Ward again. And so this is an example of a book from Phillips, Sophocles, and again, quite an expensive book. And this is Robert Ward's home in Pembrokeshire, Sotherton Manor, which after he died passed through other hands, became a prep school and is now on the market again. So they did fairly well for themselves. And that, you'll be pleased to hear, is the end. So stop share and there we are.
Unmute. Bill, thank you very much indeed. That was wonderful. Sorry, I'm trying to find a start video. Right, while we wait for me to sort out what I've done wrong, could I just mention, in your talk, you did briefly mention that, in fact, you've added one or two things to the group's blog, and I would recommend to all our members to have a look at some really interesting stuff that Bill has produced over the last couple of years. And so I suppose my question is, how much more work is there to be done?
How long is a piece of string, I suppose? I certainly have got some things lined up for the coming year. I mentioned John Venn and Richard Phillips, and I think there's a particularly interesting piece of work. Sorry, can you see me?
I can see you, yes.
I've got a thing saying Zoom on my screen
Tony
here.
has shared his screen again for some reason.
I think it says Tony's screen.
Yeah, yes. Tony, can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Look at view options next to it, Tony.
Can I?
Anyway, I can carry on talking. So I think John Venn is worth a bit more research, and also Sir Richard Phillips. I was particularly interested in this letter he wrote to the lady in Brighton, because there is a history of Richard Phillips and his involvement with Brighton, and also the fact that the neighbours of the Masquerier family, she'd become a Masquerier by then, was actually John Constable, the painter. And we have a painting of their house by John Constable. And I think this is something which could come together in a short note in due course. But I need to do that work. And I say, sadly, since the pandemic, I'm stuck away from my books and no immediate chance of getting to them. And sadly, the books in the Rare Book collection are now in Thomas Parry Library, inaccessible because of the COVID vaccination centre.
Is that taking place in Thomas Parry Library?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
So I don't think anything's going to be freed up for a while yet.
Right. Does anybody else have a question? Feel free to turn your video on again. If anybody has a question.
Unmute, of course.
And on mute, of course, yes. Let's see.
No.
Susan.
Yes, I was interested that there are as many theological works because the charter given to the University College clarified the non-sectarian principle on which Aberystwyth was established. Also Cardiff and Bangor, and also says that theology will never be taught.
Right.
Quite interesting.
Yes.
That required as many theological books.
Yes. I suppose if we look back to the early days, quite a lot of our early donors had dissenting interests or dissenting connections as ministers.
Yes.
Or in the case of Pentland Jones, he'd got some Reverend Pentland Jones had his own books, and so they have produced some interesting material, and I suspect probably have been underused over the years because we've not been strong in teaching theology, as it were. I think one of the things I was happiest to find as a curiosity was a book from the iconoclast William Dowsing, who went around East Anglia smashing the images in the parish churches there, and that was something which again produced a nice little note. So.
Does anybody else have a question? I was interested that the first arithmetic book in Welsh was actually printed in Dublin. Is there any reason for that, or? That
I don't know, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I suspect, I've not really specialised in anything on Welsh bibliography, so I guess my National Library College would be better versed to explain that.
All right. Timothy, are you aware of Welsh language books being printed in Dublin?
Yes. What's the date of that arithmetic book? Can you remind me?
It was 1768, if I remember.
Okay. Yes. So yes, I mean the legal printing began in Wales in 1718. Of course, the earliest books printed in the Welsh language were printed in London because printing wasn't legal outside Oxford, Cambridge and London until 1695. I think some books were printed in Dublin for tax reasons, weren't they? It was cheaper to print there because they avoid paying the taxes they would pay in England and Wales. That could be the explanation for it.
Yeah. I think that's certainly the case with some legal books. Some of the law reports we have are Dublin publications, and I guess that was a taxation issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much indeed, Bill. That was a very interesting talk, and I was surprised by just what a wide variety of donors there have been to the library. Before we finish the meeting,